So, what's in a fingering? I would submit that the most important thing for me, other than a good fiddle and a good bow, is choosing the right fingerings. So, that might sound crazy because you might think a fingering is just something that's on the page given to you by your teacher or the editor. So, it's just something to take for granted. And I actually know some colleagues of mine that actually improvise fingering. I don't know if improvise is the right word, but improvise fingerings um, as they see fit. Um, Even in a concert, they'll choose a fingering last minute or on the spot rather. And for me, fingering is I'm not a math person at all, but for me, I would imagine it's a little like a math proof for a piece. Um, and the more complex a piece, um, I think the more uh, solid the fingerings have to be decided ahead of time. So, one thing about fingerings is perhaps not rushing them. So, what I used to do is really, I got this really good, clever fingering for getting around the instrument at this little passage. And I'd put that in, I would scribble it in to the music, and inevitably that fingering wouldn't make the final cut down the line when I'm learning a piece. So I would suggest lightly writing in fingerings well into learning a piece. So not even writing much in. Once you're learning the notes, you'll get a sense what won't work. So you'll say, "Oh, definitely get up to third position here. I want to be on first finger on this one, the start of this passage," and just very organically write those fingerings in. But don't rush them. Don't really try to figure it all out on a first pass, second pass, third pass. Just it's going to happen. Eventually, you'll have all the fingerings that you think are the the best by the time you know the notes really well. And another thing I like to do is don't discount the craziness of some finger ideas. So if you have a passage that's well up on the G string and you're thinking, in the long run, I don't think this will probably work. Well, just put it in there. Consider it. Maybe just put in parentheses. You know, uh, do a Roman numeral 4 to indicate you're thinking jumping on the G string there. And yeah, don't get married to any one of these ideas, but don't discount, or rather, don't throw out any ideas that are just seems really crazy, because they might come in handy when you have a sort of uh, a final pass at things when you're thinking, this really does need to be expressive. Or if you're playing with an orchestra or another chamber musician, sometimes those little experiments come in handy. Like if you had a passage that was you thought maybe it could be possible on the G string, but it's a little outrageous, and then you ended up just sort of discounting that because it's a little clumsy, and then you in the practice room you decide just to you do it on the A string or something. Well, what happens when you're playing with the final production and you're playing with an orchestra or chamber music and you realize you're getting drowned out? So maybe some of those early ideas about doing something high on the G string will kind of punch you through. Or the opposite can be true. Maybe you thought this whole passage could be on the G string, and then you realize the sonority is a little pinched. So you might want to just plainly go into the low first position on the A string. So these things happen all the time, but it's good to sort of, as you explore all the fingerings, to figure out what's the range of possibilities. Don't discount silly ideas because they might come in handy later, and certainly um, take them very seriously because they are ultimately um, sort of like the clothing on your skeleton. So one thing I'd like to say is a fingering to me, as I was saying, it feels a little bit like a math proof. is if I had a topographical map, so something with hills and valleys in 3 dimensions, I would say I've arrived at good fingerings when let's say I have a peak, and the piece is the landscape. The piece is the topographical map. So it's not just the notes, but like the sections that are expressivo, sections that are bare. So that landscape is with the perfect fingering. It's like if you dropped a ball bearing or a raindrop on one of the peaks, it would find like the most efficient way out of there. And fingerings for a whole piece are a lot like that. If you haven't given them enough thought, then I always feel like I'm really not settled into the piece yet. So it's optimal fingering will be just choose the path of least resistance in that map of expressivity and such. And one thing that I would say in studying the fingerings of other musicians is, yes, there is a math proof with your fingerings, but that's within the context of your artistry, your musicianship. If you were to sort of slap on the fingerings of another musician, um, it's not optimal because you're sacrificing some of your strengths and you're not utilizing, or rather, you're sacrificing some of your strengths, and also you're tapping into the strengths of the editor or the fingerings you got those um, fingerings from. So perhaps some violinist who runs the fingerings on a certain edition has a really crazy rich pinky, and there's a lot of high passages with pinky being the way that person would optimally be the most expressive. Well, I have a very expressive third finger because it's a fatter finger, and just because the way my hand lays on the instrument, a pinky is only there to get through passages, not really to be an expressive finger, not always at least. So unfortunately, when you get music, there's usually all the fingerings laid out for you. So try to, well, maybe that's good for the first several decades, but after you settle into your musical personality, you're going to want to sort of get text non-marked versions of your music, and really spend the time, get to know the piece, and um, don't be forced into these strange boxes of other musicians. And sometimes composers will. I remember, I think it's Eugene Uzay has all kinds of fingerings um, in his music, and you should definitely consider them because a lot of them are expressive notations, and they're not there just because that was easy for that person. There was actually, in the case of Eugene Uzay, they're there for expressive cases. So if I remember the opening of the third sonata, solo sonata, um, there's this after the sort of first line, there's this moment of, so he writes in the music 1 and then 2. So this is a half step. So you could in theory go, but since he writes those everywhere, and there's been some um, confirmation from some of his students, like Joseph Gingold, that he wrote these fingerings not by mistake. They're not just these last minute little like, oh, here's some fingerings. No, these things are very well thought out. Actually, most of his stuff is extremely carefully thought out. And so these fingerings are something to be taken very seriously in the context of expressivo or expressivity. So maybe they don't work for your what you're going to be doing next, but in this case, maybe we'll do second finger. And here I'm using the third finger. So he wants 1, 2. Maybe in this case I can do 2, 3 if it suits what I'm trying to do next. So that's an example of sort of a concession that you should make when it comes to fingerings. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the heroes of mine. I've studied their fingerings. So my favorite violinist is Leonid Kogan, and he has a very interesting approach to fingerings. Basically, the best I can define it is he's sort of it's like just in time fingering, basically. So if he has a passage that will run up the instrument, he won't start moving until it's the last possible minute to get up there. So typically he's not in half positions, he's not in second positions or fourth, he's in pretty square positions, so first, third, and he won't start moving up up the instrument or down the instrument until it's the last possible minute. So when you study these fingerings, whether you get access to their fingerings from from handy downs, or you sort of study live video performances, you can really tap into some potential ideas for yourself. Perhaps not, ultimately what you'll end up doing, but just to sort of study what some of the greats do. And it is very interesting because I've learned a lot that, when you see some editors suggest getting up into the passage very early. So if you have a passage that's running up, sometimes in order to make it easier, they'll just have you run up the string quite early if it's like a scalar pattern. And then that way you can just sort of crawl over and then you're there, you're safe. It's basically this, a safety net. And then in the case of Kogan, this doesn't sound very good. There's a sonority that's lost when you're going up the instrument in order just to be safe for the passage that's to come. So with Kogan in particular, it's very interesting that even though he's very expressive and technically great, he has some plain Jane fingerings. So simple first position, third position, moving up the instrument when it's just in time, so not fancy. And then what happens is you're yielded a very sonorous sound, so that you're taking advantage of the instrument where it's ringing the most. You can make the argument that if you're choked up on the instrument, this won't sound very good, by the way, but there's very little room for the instrument to have sonority. So if you're doing passage work or up here, just to make this part a little easier, well, you're sacrificing great sound. This is where the instrument's really ringing. Does that sound great? But you get the idea. It's just don't move up the instrument until it's time. It's something you can consider. But getting back to what I was initially saying is, don't rush making the fingerings. They should be something that comes to you over time, and then they'll really jump out at you as far as which fingers to do. And as far as bowing, I'm not going to go into a whole spiel about bowing, but bowings are really complementary to the fingerings. So if you have a passage that is high up in the D or the G string, because you said to yourself, this is the way this has to sound, you're going to want a bowing that is helpful for that. So bowings, I feel like, just come a little easier, and they're very complementary of the fingerings. But keep that in mind. And happy hunting for optimal fingerings.